The wind howled through the mountain pass, carrying sharp gusts of icy snow that cut across the old woman's weathered face. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying in vain to shield herself and her two daughters from the biting cold. Each step was a battle against the snowdrifts that rose higher than their knees, and every gust threatened to push them backward, forcing them to cling to each other for balance and warmth. The journey had been too long, and their bodies ached from hunger, exhaustion, and the relentless climb through the treacherous winter terrain. The old woman's heart pounded not only from the physical strain, but from the gnawing fear that they might find no refuge in this desolate land. Their village had turned against them after a tragedy that was no fault of their own. Whispers and cruel accusations had followed them until it became impossible to remain. The daughters, barely in their teens, had tried to maintain some semblance of hope, but even their youthful spirits were dimming under the weight of despair. The mother glanced at them, seeing the red-rimmed eyes and pale cheeks, and felt a surge of protectiveness and sorrow. She had promised herself that she would not let them perish in the cold, that she would find shelter, food, and safety, no matter how remote the mountain or how strange the man who might live there. Through the swirling white haze, a thin wisp of smoke caught her eye, curling upward from what appeared to be a cabin tucked against a ridge. It was small and humble, half hidden among snow-laden pines, but to the old woman it was a beacon, a fragile sign of life and warmth in an otherwise merciless wilderness. Hope, long dormant, flickered inside her chest. She tightened her grip on her daughter's hands and urged them forward, each step feeling heavier yet more purposeful than the last. As they approached, the cabin revealed itself in more detail. The rough-hewn logs, the faint glow of firelight through a small window, the chimney sending steady smoke into the cold sky. The old woman's heart beat faster. Finally, they had found a place that might offer them protection from the storm and the cruelty that haunted them. She hesitated only for a moment, knowing that asking for help from a stranger could be dangerous. Yet the thought of her children succumbing to the cold was far more terrifying. Raising a trembling hand, she knocked on the door. The sound echoed, harsh and brittle, swallowed almost immediately by the whistling wind. She called out softly, her voice strained but full of earnest desperation. "Please, we have nowhere else to go." "May we come in?" The words barely carried over the roar of the storm, yet she repeated them, louder this time, the desperation in her voice shaking her own resolve. Moments passed with agonizing slowness. Then the door creaked open, and a tall, rugged figure emerged. The mountain man's face was lined and weathered, his eyes sharp yet guarded, measuring every detail of the strangers who had dared approach his solitary home. He was a man accustomed to isolation, to trusting only himself, and the intrusion of these weary travelers into his domain stirred both suspicion and something more tentative, a flicker of compassion. The old woman stepped forward, bowing slightly, trying to convey both humility and desperation. Her daughters hovered close, shivering and silent, their wide eyes reflecting both fear and longing. She spoke quickly, explaining their plight, her voice catching with every word. The mountain man listened, silent, his gaze piercing yet inscrutable. Finally, after a long, tense pause, he moved aside, gesturing for them to enter. It was not a warm invitation, but it was enough a chance for shelter, a chance to survive, and a spark of hope that their ordeal might not end in the merciless cold of the mountain. The cabin smelled of smoke and pine, a sharp contrast to the biting wind outside. The old woman stepped cautiously over the threshold, clutching her daughter's hands tightly. The mountain man closed the door behind them with a firm push, and immediately the warmth of the small fire washed over them, searing through frozen limbs like liquid sunlight. The daughters shivered in relief, drawing their shawls tighter, and the old woman exhaled a long, trembling breath. For the first time in days, she felt a faint glimmer of safety. The mountain man stood silently for a moment, his hands resting on the edge of a sturdy wooden table, eyes scanning the newcomers as if reading a book written in desperation and sorrow. His face was rough, lined by years of isolation and hardship, yet there was something in his gaze that betrayed both caution and curiosity. He didn't speak immediately. Words, in his world, were measured and deliberate. The old woman could feel the weight of his scrutiny and instinctively straightened her posture, trying to convey honesty and humility. We have nowhere else to go," she said softly, her voice quivering. "And the storm." She gestured toward the window where snow swirled in wild sheets. "We can't survive out there another night." The mountain man's eyes flicked toward the window, then back at her. He said nothing, only nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. His silence was both a judgment and a promise. Finally he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, shaped by years of speaking rarely. "You can stay, just for the night." The old woman's heart leapt. She thanked him, her words tumbling out in a rush of gratitude, yet she sensed the restraint in him. This was not an open invitation to ease and to comfort. He meant survival, not hospitality. Her daughters clung to her skirts, their eyes wide, taking in the cabin with a mixture of awe and fear. Inside, the cabin was modest yet functional. Rough-hewn furniture lined the walls, and a shelf held jars of preserved food-dried herbs, berries, and smoked meat. A small, worn rug covered the floor in front of the fire, and the hearth itself was made of stone, blackened from years of use. The mountain man moved with careful efficiency, tending the fire and arranging small portions of food on a wooden plate. Each movement was precise, deliberate. There was no waste in his actions, no idle motion. He was a man shaped by the unforgiving mountain, a life where survival required skill, patience, and unspoken rules. The old woman hesitated, unsure whether to help. She didn't want to overstep, yet she feared appearing helpless. "May I help with the fire?" she asked tentatively. The mountain man shook his head. "Rest," he said simply. "You need strength." His words were short, but his intent was clear. They were safe for now. The daughters edged closer to the fire, marveling at the warmth and the way the flames danced and crackled. One of them, the younger, reached out a tentative hand toward the hearth, feeling the heat, and giggled softly despite herself. The mountain man's eyes softened just a fraction at the sound, a fleeting glimpse of humanity beneath the rugged exterior. As they ate the meager meal he provided, conversation was sparse. The old woman tried to speak, to ease the tension, sharing fragments of their journey and the hardships they had endured. The mountain man responded in short, measured phrases, never revealing too much about himself. Yet, in every carefully chosen word and every deliberate gesture, he conveyed a sense of quiet competence, a subtle reassurance that they were under his protection. By the time the meal ended, the storm outside had grown fiercer. The old woman felt a pang of guilt for the intrusion, yet she also felt an undeniable relief. Here, in this isolated cabin, they had found refuge. Perhaps, she thought, the mountain man was more than just a silent guardian. Perhaps he was the first person they could trust in a long time. And yet, the air remained thick with unspoken questions. Who was this man? Why did he live alone in such a harsh place? And could a solitary mountain man truly be a friend, or was he merely a temporary protector until the world claimed them once more? The next morning, the first pale light of dawn filtered through the frost-lined window, painting the cabin in soft shades of silver and gold. The storm outside had lessened to a gentle whisper of wind and snow, but the mountain remained wild and untamed. The old woman and her daughters woke to a quiet rhythm of life that was completely foreign to them, a life shaped by solitude, resilience, and the unforgiving demands of the wilderness. The mountain man was already awake. He moved about the cabin with methodical precision, tending the fire and checking the jars of preserved food. There was no rush in his movements, only an efficient, practiced ease that came from years of living in isolation. He carried water from a nearby stream in a wooden bucket, the ice-cold water sloshing carefully as he navigated the uneven ground outside. The old woman watched silently, marveling at his skill and composure. Each action he took was deliberate and purposeful, a reflection of a life built on self-reliance. Curiosity pulled at her, and after a moment she gestured to the cabin around them. This is all yours?" she asked, her voice a mix of wonder and hesitation. The mountain man's eyes flicked toward her, and he nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement. "It is," he said simply, no elaboration needed. The cabin was more than a shelter. It was a testament to his years of survival. Every log, every jar, every scratch on the furniture spoke of a man who had weathered hardship and learned to endure in a land that demanded vigilance and strength. The daughters, drawn to the fire again, examined the small treasures scattered throughout the room: a bundle of dried herbs, neatly stacked firewood, a worn hunting knife hanging on the wall. Each object seemed carefully chosen, maintained with respect and care. One of the girls, braver than the other, asked softly, "Do you hunt your own food?" The mountain man's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes," he said, and his eyes narrowed, not with anger but with the weight of truth. Hunting was not a sport or pastime, it was survival. As the morning unfolded, the old woman began to understand the rhythm of this man's world. There was no idle chatter, no unnecessary motion. The fireplace was always tended, the tools were always in order, and the animals outside were watched with keen vigilance. He shared small bits of knowledge without explanation: how to split wood efficiently, how to preserve berries in winter, how to recognize the signs of an approaching storm. Every lesson carried the unspoken message: respect the mountain, respect its power, and you will survive. The family felt a mixture of awe and humility. Here was a man who lived entirely by his own skill and wit, a man shaped by solitude and hardship. And yet, beneath the rough exterior, there was a quiet kindness. When the younger daughter shivered despite her shawl, he did not scold or dismiss her. He simply handed her a thick blanket, his gesture small but full of care. It was the first sign that while he lived apart from the world, he was not devoid of compassion. Lunch came, modest but nourishing: preserved meat, dried fruit, and warm water from the spring. The old woman tried to engage him in conversation, sharing fragments of their past, their journey, and the cruelty of their former village. He listened, his expression unreadable, and responded only in short, deliberate sentences. Yet even in these sparse exchanges, there was a rhythm forming, a tentative understanding, the first threads of trust weaving between them. By mid-afternoon, the daughters had begun to explore the immediate surroundings under his watchful eye. The mountain was both beautiful and dangerous, blanketed in white snow and dotted with dark pines. The mountain man followed silently, letting them marvel at the frozen streams and snow-covered ridges, yet always alert, ever ready to intervene if the wilderness threatened them. In his quiet way, he taught them a crucial lesson: to survive here, one must observe, respect, and adapt. As evening approached, the old woman realized that the mountain man's world was not just a place of survival, it was a testament to resilience, skill, and quiet dignity. This solitary figure, whom the world had largely ignored, had built a life that balanced danger and beauty, hardship and careful stewardship. And for the first time, she began to feel a glimmer of hope. Perhaps in this harsh mountain refuge, her family could find not only safety, but also a place to belong. The first evening in the cabin carried a strange mixture of relief and unease. The old woman had hoped that warmth and shelter might immediately dissolve the tension, but she quickly realized that the mountain man's silence was a force of its own. He moved around the cabin with quiet purpose, stacking firewood, checking the stove, and arranging the remaining food. Every action, measured and deliberate, seemed almost ritualistic, as though his life had been reduced to the essentials necessary for survival, and anything beyond that was either unnecessary or dangerous. The daughters hovered near the fire, watching the flickering flames and listening to the soft creaks of the cabin settling in the cold. They whispered to each other occasionally, voices hushed and cautious, afraid of drawing attention. But their laughter was small and tentative, like the first buds of spring pushing through snow. The old woman, sensing the need to ease the tension, attempted conversation, asking questions about the mountain, the cabin, and the routines of a life so foreign to them. The mountain man responded in short, clipped sentences. Snow will worsen tonight. Fire must burn steady. Water must be fetched before dark. He offered no elaboration, no personal anecdotes, no stories of who he was or why he lived this life. The old woman noticed that while he spoke minimally, every word carried weight. Every instruction or comment was deliberate and essential. There was no excess in his language, just as there was none in his movements. As the hours passed, the family began to settle into the rhythm of the cabin. The old woman served a modest supper, using the small portions of food the mountain man had prepared. It was humble, but nourishing, and the act of sharing it around the fire felt almost ceremonial, a fragile bridge forming between them and their silent host. The daughters, timid at first, began to mimic small chores, rinsing bowls, stacking wood near the hearth, and tending to the fire under his watchful eye. Though the mountain man did not instruct them directly, he allowed them to help, correcting gently when they faltered, offering small nods of approval when they succeeded. Despite these small moments of connection, the air was thick with caution. The old woman could sense that the mountain man's trust was not given freely, and that every gesture of kindness, every meal, every warmth offered, was measured against the backdrop of his solitary life. She understood instinctively that in this harsh wilderness, survival was not just a matter of skill but of judgment, of knowing whom to trust and when. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, rattling the cabin walls and rattling the shutters. The storm was relentless, a reminder that the mountain was indifferent to human suffering. Yet inside, the fire burned steady, a small island of warmth and light. The old woman found herself watching the mountain man as he moved about the cabin, noticing the care he took in his tasks, the patience in his movements, and the quiet strength that emanated from him. He was a man who had faced the harshest elements and endured, yet there was an undercurrent of solitude and unspoken sorrow that made her heart ache. By nightfall, the old woman realized that this evening had been a test of sorts, not just of their endurance, but of their ability to adapt to this unfamiliar life. She sensed that the mountain man's world operated on its own rules, and that any misstep could fracture the fragile trust forming between them. But she also sensed something more subtle, a quiet acknowledgement that they had arrived in his domain, and that for the moment they were permitted to remain. As the family huddled by the fire, the storm raging outside, the old woman whispered to her daughters, "We are safe for now, and perhaps we may yet find more than safety here." Her words carried both hope and caution. The mountain man, seated silently nearby, said nothing, yet his steady presence spoke volumes. In the flickering firelight, the boundaries of fear and trust began to blur, and the family realized that survival in the mountains was not only about enduring the cold, but about navigating the complex human heart that lived within the cabin walls. The wind outside had grown fierce again, howling through the pines like a pack of wolves. Snow slammed against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters and shaking the roof. Inside, the fire roared in defiance of the storm, casting warm, golden light across the small room. The old woman sat close to the hearth, her daughters pressed against her sides, shivering despite the blankets wrapped tightly around them. The storm seemed relentless, as if the mountain itself were testing their courage and endurance. The mountain man moved with calm precision. He checked the fire, rearranging logs so that the flames would burn longer and hotter. Then he went to the windows, securing each shutter and reinforcing them with the heavy iron latches. He moved silently, efficiently, as though every action were instinctual, a lifetime of experience distilled into motion. The old woman watched him with growing admiration. Here was a man who not only survived in the wilderness but had learned to master it, to anticipate its dangers and respond with a skill that bordered on artistry. The younger daughter, trembling, whispered, "Mother, what if the wind blows the cabin away?" Her eyes were wide with fear, reflecting the flickering firelight. The old woman squeezed her hand, trying to reassure her, but even she could not entirely hide her own anxiety. The mountain man, overhearing the question, did not reply immediately. Instead, he added another log to the fire, then crouched near the window, studying the snowdrifts outside. Finally, he said in his low, steady voice, "Cabin will hold. Mountain respects strength and preparation. We are ready." It was a simple statement, yet it carried a weight of certainty that no words of comfort could match. The old woman felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time in days, she believed they might survive the storm. She looked at her daughters and saw the same mixture of awe and trust reflected in their faces. They were beginning to understand that survival was not just about warmth or food, it was about the vigilance and knowledge the mountain man carried in every gesture. As the hours passed, the family settled into a tense, quiet routine. The old woman kept her daughters close, offering small bits of conversation and trying to distract them from the raging storm outside. The mountain man moved among them with quiet efficiency, checking the fire, preparing a modest meal of preserved meat and berries, and ensuring that water from the stream had not frozen over. Each action was both practical and protective, a silent demonstration of care that spoke more loudly than words. The storm raged through the night, snow piling high against the cabin walls, yet the mountain man's presence brought an unexpected sense of security. The daughters, once fearful and hesitant, began to feel safe in his competence. The younger daughter curled up near his chair, captivated by the steady rhythm of his movements. The older daughter watched him tend the fire, learning silently the small skills that kept them alive in this harsh wilderness. In the quiet moments, the old woman reflected on the journey that had brought them here. They had come to the mountains seeking refuge, uncertain whether anyone would offer it. And now, in the midst of the storm, they realized that this solitary man, this rugged, silent figure, had not only provided shelter, but had become their protector. The fire, the cabin, the careful arrangements of food and warmth all were extensions of his guardianship, proof that kindness could exist even in the harshest, most unforgiving places. By the time the storm began to wane, the old woman understood something vital. Survival was not merely a matter of endurance, but of trust. And in this mountain refuge, trust was slowly taking root, growing in the spaces between the wind and snow, in the warmth of the fire, and in the quiet, steady presence of a man who had chosen to care even when he had no obligation to do so. As dawn approached, the wind softened, leaving behind a pristine, glittering blanket of snow. The old woman watched her daughters sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, and for the first time she allowed herself a tentative smile. The mountain man, standing by the door and surveying the transformed landscape, had not said a word, yet the unspoken bond forming between them was undeniable. The storm had passed, and with it, the first seeds of hope had taken root. The morning after the storm dawned crisp and clear, the sun glinting off the thick blanket of snow that now coated the mountain in shimmering white. The air was sharp and invigorating, carrying the scent of pine and frozen earth. Inside the cabin, the old woman and her daughters began to stir, waking to a world transformed by the night's blizzard. There was a stillness outside, broken only by the occasional creak of a bending tree or the distant call of a bird daring the cold. The mountain man had already begun his morning routine. He tended the fire, adding freshly chopped wood and ensuring the flames burned steady and bright. He checked the water supply, carefully breaking the thin ice over the stream and filling the container that would serve as their source of drinking and cooking water for the day. The old woman watched him silently, marveling at the precision and quiet efficiency of every movement. To the daughters, he seemed almost otherworldly in his competence, an unspoken teacher showing the ways of survival in a land that demanded respect and vigilance. For the first time since their arrival, the old woman felt a sense of calm. The storm had tested them, but it had also revealed the mountain man's character, capable, reliable, and quietly compassionate. She realized that trust was beginning to take root, fragile but growing, in their relationship with him. The daughters, still shivering slightly from the residual cold, observed every action with rapt attention, absorbing the lessons of a life shaped by the wilderness. The mountain man began to include them in small tasks, allowing them to take part in his careful routines. The older daughter was shown how to stack firewood properly, ensuring each log would burn efficiently, while the younger daughter learned to help with simple chores like stirring the water and arranging food for the day. The instructions were sparse, conveyed with a few short sentences and demonstrations rather than lengthy explanations. Yet even this minimal guidance carried a profound lesson. Survival required focus, observation, and respect for the mountain's power. The old woman assisted where she could, fetching water and helping to prepare a simple breakfast of preserved meat, bread, and dried fruit. Though modest, the meal tasted like sustenance and comfort, a welcome reprieve after the previous day's ordeal. Sitting around the fire, she watched the mountain man move among them, offering quiet approval when the daughters succeeded at their tasks and correcting gently when they faltered. Each small gesture of guidance and care deepened the growing bond between them, a silent language of trust and mutual respect forming in the warmth of the cabin. Later, the mountain man took the daughters outside under his watchful eye. He showed them how to identify safe paths through the snow, how to recognize footprints of animals, and even how to carefully break branches for firewood without harming the surrounding trees. The lessons were practical, immediate, and rooted in survival, but they carried a larger truth. The mountain demanded respect, and those who learned to observe and adapt could thrive even in its harshest conditions. The girls listened intently, absorbing each instruction with a mixture of awe and admiration. The old woman observed quietly, feeling a mixture of gratitude and relief. For days they had wandered, unsure of what awaited them at the end of their journey. Now they had a guide, a protector, and a teacher rolled into one rugged figure who had chosen to care for them without expectation. Small acts of trust, allowing the daughters to help, offering guidance, sharing food, were shaping a sense of security that had been absent for too long. By the end of the day, the family had settled into a rhythm, each finding a place within the cabin's small world. The old woman realized that survival was no longer just about enduring the cold or avoiding danger. It was about connection, about finding a presence to rely upon, and learning to trust that the mountain, the cabin, and the man who had sheltered them could keep them safe. And for the first time, hope felt tangible, like the steady warmth of the fire that burned at the heart of their refuge. The fire crackled softly in the cabin as evening settled over the mountain. Outside, the wind had softened to a gentle murmur, and the snow sparkled under the pale light of a rising moon. The family sat close to the hearth, the warmth seeping into their chilled bones. After days of constant movement, storm, and uncertainty, a quiet moment had finally arrived, a rare pause that allowed both reflection and conversation. The old woman, feeling the fragile bond between them growing stronger, decided it was time to share her story. She looked at the mountain man, who sat silently across from her, his eyes reflecting the firelight but betraying no emotion. She began cautiously, her voice soft and measured. She spoke of the village that had turned against them, of the tragedy that had driven them from their home, and of the cruelty and misunderstanding that had followed them relentlessly. She spoke not to seek pity, but to explain who they were, to give the mountain man the context he needed to understand why they had come seeking shelter. Her daughters, listening quietly, clung to her hands, occasionally glancing at the mountain man to gauge his reaction. They had been hesitant to trust him fully, but as their mother's story unfolded, the raw vulnerability in her words seemed to soften the unspoken barriers that had kept them cautious. There was no dramatization, no exaggeration, only the truth of loss, fear, and displacement, laid bare in the warmth of the cabin. The mountain man remained silent for a long while after she finished. His expression was unreadable, as always, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a relaxation of the rigid lines of his body. Finally, in his low, deliberate voice, he spoke. "I understand," he said simply. And though he offered no further explanation, the weight of those two words carried a quiet, profound acknowledgment. They had not just found shelter in his cabin, they had found someone who could comprehend the depth of their pain. For the first time, the old woman sensed a flicker of humanity behind his stoic exterior. She dared to ask, cautiously, "And you? Why do you live alone here?" The mountain man's gaze drifted toward the window where the snow-laden trees stood silent and stark against the dark sky. After a moment, he replied, "I lost much. People I trusted, gone. Solitude is easier than disappointment." There was a pause, heavy but not uncomfortable, as the old woman processed his words. She realized that his silence, his cautiousness, and his initial hesitation to offer shelter were not signs of coldness, but of experience, of a heart that had been hurt and learned to protect itself. And yet, despite the walls he had built, he had chosen to allow them in, to offer them warmth and sustenance, and perhaps, unknowingly, a chance at healing. The daughters, sensing the subtle connection forming between their mother and the mountain man, began to speak as well. The older daughter asked questions about the mountain, the animals, and the life he had built. The younger daughter, shy at first, asked why he had stayed so long in one place and if he had ever been afraid of being alone. His responses were brief but honest, carrying a weight of lived experience and quiet wisdom. Each word, each gesture, chipped away at the barriers between them, building a fragile bridge of understanding and trust. By the time the fire had burned down to glowing embers, the old woman felt a sense of relief she had not known in weeks. Secrets had been shared, truths revealed, and in the process, the foundation of a tentative family had begun to take shape. She realized that the mountain man, despite his solitary life and guarded heart, was capable of compassion, empathy, and connection. And in that realization, hope began to blossom not just for survival, but for the possibility of belonging, of healing, and of creating a new life together amidst the harsh beauty of the mountain. The night closed around the cabin, peaceful for the first time in days. And in the quiet warmth of the fire, the family felt the subtle but profound truth that even the most guarded hearts could open, and that trust, once earned, could bring light to the darkest corners of life. The morning was bright and clear, a deceptive calm after days of snow and storm. The cabin, nestled against the mountain slope, seemed peaceful, almost idyllic, with the sun reflecting off the pristine snow. The daughters played quietly outside, building small snow mounds and giggling, their laughter echoing faintly through the pines. Inside, the old woman prepared a simple breakfast, while the mountain man went about his morning routine with silent precision. But peace in the mountains is always fragile. A sudden rustle in the trees alerted the mountain man, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet familiar to his trained senses. His head snapped toward the sound, eyes narrowing. A shadow moved among the snow-laden branches, too large to be a deer, too deliberate to be the wind. He gestured silently for the family to come inside, his movements sharp, controlled, and commanding. The old woman's heart pounded. She followed him quickly, gathering her daughters, who looked at him with wide, alarmed eyes. They sensed the tension in his movements, the readiness in his posture. Outside, through the frosted windows, A man approached a stranger from the lower villages, clearly unaccustomed to the harsh mountain terrain. His eyes were calculating, scanning the cabin as if assessing its occupants for opportunity or weakness. The mountain man stepped forward, positioning himself between the cabin and the intruder. His presence alone was a statement. This place was under his protection, and no one would harm the family within these walls. The old woman could feel his resolve radiating outward, a shield stronger than any barrier of wood and stone. The stranger hesitated, uncertain. He likely assumed the mountain man was alone, a solitary figure who could be intimidated or bribed. But as the mountain man spoke, his voice low, steady, and unwavering, the intruder's bravado faltered. "You have no business here," he said. "Turn back." There was no anger, no shouting, only the absolute certainty of a man who had lived through harsher storms, who knew the land, and who knew how to protect what mattered. The intruder glared, then lunged, attempting to intimidate with threats. The mountain man did not flinch. With skill honed from years in isolation, he moved quickly, using leverage and precise force to neutralize the threat without unnecessary violence. The daughters watched, awestruck, as a man who had seemed mysterious and distant moments ago revealed the fierce, unwavering courage that had kept him alive in this unforgiving wilderness. The intruder, now subdued and recognizing the futility of his attempt, retreated into the trees, disappearing into the white expanse of snow. The mountain man watched him go, ensuring there was no further danger before turning back to the family. His expression softened just slightly, a quiet reassurance that the danger had passed. The old woman's daughters ran to him, hugging his legs, and she felt a profound surge of gratitude and awe. This man, once a stranger who had begrudgingly offered them shelter, had proven himself to be their protector in the most tangible way. The bond between them had shifted irrevocably. No longer was he just a cautious host. He had become a guardian, a pillar of safety and strength. Inside the cabin, the family huddled by the fire, their hands brushing over the warmth as they processed what had just occurred. The daughters whispered their admiration and relief, while the old woman looked at the mountain man with a mixture of respect and trust. She realized that the man who had seemed distant, reserved, and solitary had a heart capable of fierce loyalty and protection, and that her family's survival in this harsh place was inseparable from his courage. By evening, the mountain had returned to its quiet majesty. Snow glittered under the fading light, and the cabin was calm once more. The old woman understood that their lives had changed permanently, not just because of the shelter he provided, but because they had witnessed his bravery and dedication. They were no longer merely guests. They were part of a small, fragile family shaped by trust, courage, and the unspoken promise of protection that would endure through every storm the mountain could bring. Days turned into weeks, and the mountain began to reveal a quieter rhythm. The storm had passed, leaving behind sparkling snow and crisp, cold air. The cabin, once merely a shelter, now felt like the center of a small, fragile world. The old woman and her daughters had settled into routines alongside the mountain man, learning the subtle rhythms of his life and the demands of the wilderness. In turn, he had begun to accept their presence as natural, almost necessary, rather than a temporary intrusion. The daughters were the first to truly transform. No longer timid or fearful, they explored the snow-covered slopes with a mixture of wonder and confidence. The younger daughter, once hesitant and shy, had begun helping with small chores outside, collecting branches for firewood, identifying tracks in the snow, and even learning to carry buckets of water from the stream without spilling a drop. The older daughter had become adept at assisting with food preparation and fire maintenance, her hands steady and sure, her laughter beginning to fill the cabin with warmth. The old woman observed this transformation with a mixture of pride and relief. She had feared the harsh mountain would be too much for her daughters, yet under the mountain man's quiet guidance, they had begun to flourish. His lessons were practical, his corrections gentle but firm, and even without overt displays of emotion, he had become a patient and attentive teacher. The bond between them was no longer tentative, it was growing into something tangible, a sense of belonging that had been absent from their lives for too long. The mountain man himself was also changing, though subtly. He had always been a man of solitude, a figure shaped by loss and self-reliance, but now there was a softness to his presence. He began to speak more, though still sparingly, answering questions about the land, the animals, and even the small details of his daily life. He shared stories of his past, not tragedies or failures, but observations and lessons learned from living in the wild. The old woman noticed that when he spoke to the daughters, his tone carried warmth, a quiet affection that he did not extend to many. It was in the way he allowed them small freedoms, in the approving nod when they completed a task, and in the rare, fleeting smiles he offered when they laughed. Even the mountain itself seemed to mirror this transformation. What had once felt harsh and unyielding now seemed majestic, even inviting. The family began to walk further along the slopes, the daughters' laughter echoing across valleys that had once seemed intimidating. They built snow forts together, learned to track animals in the woods, and began to understand the delicate balance of respect and caution that life on the mountain demanded. Each day was a lesson, and each lesson deepened their bond, not only with the land but with the man who had rescued them from despair. The old woman realized with a profound sense of gratitude that the mountain man had become more than a protector. He was a teacher, a guide, and increasingly a quiet presence around which they could build a life. The cabin, once simply a refuge from the storm, had become a home, and the fire at its center a symbol of the warmth that trust and care could create. By the end of the day, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, the old woman felt a rare sense of peace. They were no longer just surviving. They were living, learning, and belonging. The mountain man, once a figure of solitude and mystery, had opened his heart ever so slightly to a family that had wandered into his life in desperation. And in that opening he had changed as much as they had, allowing himself to experience connection, trust, and the beginnings of companionship. For the first time, the old woman understood that their lives on the mountain were no longer temporary or tentative. They were part of something enduring, shaped by courage, care, and the unspoken bonds of trust that had grown in the quiet, rugged wilderness. They were a family imperfect, unlikely, but real. Spring began to creep over the mountain, softening the edges of the harsh winter with glimmers of green beneath the melting snow. The air was warmer, the streams flowed freely, and the birds returned to fill the silent woods with song. The cabin, once a refuge from blizzards and storms, had transformed into a home lived in, cared for, and filled with the quiet rhythms of family life. The old woman and her daughters moved about confidently, tending the fire, preparing meals, and exploring the slopes with a growing sense of ease. The mountain man, once solitary and unyielding, had become an integral part of this life. His movements were still precise, still shaped by the demands of the wilderness, but now there was a subtle warmth in the way he interacted with the family. He laughed softly at the daughters' playful antics, offered guidance without strictness, and shared small personal stories that hinted at the loneliness he had endured. Each day revealed new facets of his heart, previously hidden beneath years of solitude and self-protection. The daughter's growth was remarkable. The older one, with confidence in her steps and hands, helped the mountain man with small tasks outside, learning the art of survival while embracing the beauty of the mountain. The younger daughter, once timid and fearful, ran freely along the snowy ridges, her laughter ringing through the trees, and she would often pause to watch the mountain man's work with awe and admiration. The old woman watched them both with quiet pride, realizing that the mountain had become a place of healing, learning, and belonging. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the peaks and painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, the old woman approached the mountain man while he tended the fire. For a long moment, They stood in silence, listening to the wind rustle through the pines and the distant call of a returning bird. She spoke softly, her voice carrying both gratitude and reflection. "We never imagined we would find safety, let alone a home in such a place. You've changed everything for us." The mountain man's expression softened, a rare, genuine smile appearing on his weathered face. He gestured toward the cabin, then the slopes beyond, encompassing the life they had begun to build together. "You belong here," he said simply. This is home now. For all of us." His words were not grand or dramatic, but in their simplicity lay a profound truth. The solitude he had once prized was no longer complete, replaced by connection, trust, and the quiet joy of shared lives. That evening, the family gathered around the fire. The daughters leaned against their mother and the mountain man, the warmth of the flames reflecting in their eyes. Stories were shared, small laughter echoed, and the unspoken bond that had grown over weeks of storms, danger, and care filled the cabin with a sense of permanence. The mountain, once a symbol of isolation and hardship, had become a sanctuary, its beauty and challenge tempered by the strength and love of those within the cabin. The old woman realized that the mountain man's single act of shelter had changed far more than the family's immediate fate. It had created a new life. The daughters had found safety, trust, and guidance. She had found hope and peace. And the mountain man, who had once lived only for survival, had discovered companionship, purpose, and a quiet happiness that solitude could never provide. As night fell and stars glittered over the snow-covered peaks, the family sat together in the cabin, the fire crackling steadily. Outside, the mountain loomed vast and eternal, indifferent yet majestic. Inside, however, a family thrived, a family shaped not by circumstance, but by courage, trust, and the simple yet profound power of shelter, care, and kindness. They had endured the storm, both outside and within their hearts, and had emerged stronger, connected, and ready to face the life that lay ahead. In that small cabin on the mountain, they had found more than safety. They had found belonging, love, and the promise of a new beginning.